Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 5th of July 2022. The articles which we shall take up today have been displayed on the screen, and let us now begin the discussion. The first article which we have taken up is a very important one. A chaotic world, the perils of multilateralism, where the author says that PM Narendra Modi is having a dream run when it comes to diplomacy. He has attended a Quad Summit, BRICS Summit and G7 Summit in a matter of a month, and that could be a dream for any statesman because these are the groups which are going to shape the future of the world. Apart from that, he also talks about various intergovernmental organizations or multilateral institutions or groupings which are undergoing fundamental changes and may not be fertile places for building peace and cooperation. And he says one very important line in the article: bilateral engagements may be a much more productive at this point in history. And this article has brought the importance of multilateralism, a process of organizing relations where a group of 3 or more countries interact with each other. If you compare it with unilateralism, where a country acts unilaterally, or bilateralism, where 2 countries interact with each other for mutual benefit, multilateralism stands out. When you read the global affairs, what you read about is United Nations, World Trade Organizations, IMF, World Bank. All of these are multilateral institutions. And most of them were created in the aftermath of World War II, and they were propounded and facilitated by the West and especially United States of America. They have of course done a lot of things for the global community, but in recent times, they have been called into question. They are facing significant challenges because of their ineffectivity. And so it is important for us to take up these arguments. If you look at the GS Paper 2 syllabus, it says bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India or affecting India's interests. Then international institutions also is a part of your syllabus. So we are going to first understand what multilateralism is and how is it distinguished from other such bodies, especially minilateral bodies or bilateral relations. What are the advantages that it has to offer? And then finally, what are the challenges that it is posing? Also, if you have understood this topic well, you can solve this practice question, which is multilateralism is coming under threat mainly due to the actions of the developed countries. Do you agree? So what is multilateralism? At the very basic, it's the process of organizing relations between groups of 3 or more states or countries. So whenever 2 countries, for example, A and B interact with each other, that is called bilateralism. When a single country acts alone, that is called unilateralism. But when a group of 3 or more countries develop a process to organize their relationships, that is called multilateralism. So what could be some of the examples of global multilateralism? The best example, of course, is United Nations. Then you have World Trade Organization. Then, of course, you have IMF, which was recently taken up in the DNS. Then, of course, you have World Bank. So these are global multilateral institutions where more than 170 countries have come together, which satisfies the definition of 3 or more, and have developed a process to organize their relationships. United Nations has much wider connotation, whereas World Trade Organization is more about trade. IMF is more about fiscal policies and financial matters. World Bank is more about development related aid and policies. So although multilateralism has a long history, but it is primarily associated with the era after the World War II. And you can clearly see that all these global multilateral institutions were created post World War II, during which there was a large number of or emergence of large number of multilateral agreements, which were primarily led by United States in particular and West in general. And of course, you will see that later on this will emerge as one of the basic criticisms of these multilateral institutions. And still, the way these organizations are set up, the way they function, the way they governed, it's basically marked by the hegemony or the dominance of West in general and USA in particular. So what is it that separates multilateralism from other regional organizations?
And these are three very important principles: the principle of indivisibility, the principle of reciprocity, and the principle of dispute settlement. So when we talk about these groups which should have three or more members, we are often confused with respect to the groups like World Trade Organization (IMF) and groups like RCEP or ASEAN, because after all these groups have three or more members. So will they be called multilateral institutions or multilateral group? And so the answer is no, because a multilateral group or organization should have three very distinct principles, or should be based upon these three principles: the principle of indivisibility, reciprocity, and dispute settlement. Starting with indivisibility. Indivisibility basically means that there should not be any kind of distinction of interests. For example, NATO, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has been in news a lot. NATO is a very clear-cut example to show the principle of indivisibility. All of us know its principle of collective security, in which a war against one state is considered to be a war against all the states, ensuring that any act of aggression against a member is met with a response from all the members. And this was the basic reason why Russia chose to attack Ukraine, because Ukraine was about to enter into NATO, which would have enabled Ukraine to secure collective security. And so you can clearly see that security of a particular country, of a group or a collective, is treated as a security of everyone. So it is believed in multilateralism that if the interest of one of the nation is threatened, so is the interest of all of them, and then it is treated alike. Another example of this would be the most favored nation status given under WTO. As soon as a country becomes a member of World Trade Organization, it has to enable certain level of preferential treatment to all other members of WTO. And here, the interest is the trade liberalization or easing of the trade of goods and services. But this is very different from what you have in a bilateral relation. Bilateralism, by contrast, fragments relation between the states. If India is going to enter into comprehensive economic partnership with, let's say, UAE, then the terms of trade available to UAE would be very different to those available to other countries. Then after indivisibility, another very important principle is the principle of or diffuse reciprocity. Now, what does this term means? Now, in multilateralism, for example, let's take again the situation of collective security of NATO. And let's say tomorrow Russia decides to attack Germany or any other country which is a part of NATO and hence has the right for collective security, and all other countries enter into collaboration to defend Germany and in retaliation attack Russia. There will be a lot of war budget which will be expended by these countries. So, will these countries be eligible for reimbursement of the war efforts? No. There is an expectation that there will not be an equivalence of obligations, because their compensation or recompensation lies in the knowledge that should they be attacked, they too will benefit from collective response in the aftermath of any particular attack. And also, the world is now knowing that all the countries can come together and defend Germany, and they should never touch any of the members of NATO, because US along with France might also detonate nuclear weapon to defend the NATO countries, and that is the advantage and not the recompensation of the war efforts. And if you look at it, the indivisibility, that no distinction of interest, is the parent principle through which the principle of diffuse reciprocity is being derived. Because if the countries see each other's interests as their own, they are never going to demand for equivalence of obligation. They will consider it as their own defense. And finally comes the dispute settlement. For the states to feel assured of the returns of treating their interest as indivisible, multilateral arrangements tend to incorporate some mechanism for ensuring that countries act in accordance with the expected norms. And these countries evolve various kinds of mechanisms, for example, compliance, peer review, which may suit more informal arrangements, or the creation of more formalized body in case of WTO. WTO's dispute settlement mechanism to enable the dispute settlement. And now you can see how important dispute settlement is. Just because dispute settlement is not functioning well in past 3 years in case of WTO, people have started raising question on the relevance and future importance of WTO. So now the obvious question is, what do countries gain by entering into multilateralism, and what are the challenges which multilateralism is facing as of now, because of which the author had to say that this might be an era where India should be focusing more on bilateral relations. And so there are four distinct reasons because of which the countries chose to enter into large number of multilateral institutions, especially after World War II. And the first one is directly related to the Second World War, where the unilateral steps taken by Axis powers were in majority responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War. And so it was decided that it's time to discourage the unilateralism. Unilateralism is basically a doctrine or agenda that supports one-sided action. Such action may be in disregard to other parties as well. And more often than not, when countries choose to act unilaterally, they end up hurting the global or the regional cause. And so it has been found that multilateralism discourages unilateralism. And you can see that barring few exceptions of unilateral steps taken by United States of America, for example, their actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, their walking out of Paris climate deal, even before that Kyoto agreement, except barring those instances, not many countries have chose to act unilaterally in past 40 to 50 years. And so you can say that this has been one of the biggest advantage of multilateralism. But it's just not about discouragement to unilateralism. Multilateralism gives voice to small powers or middle powers like India, Brazil, Russia, or even smaller countries. Multilateralism might not give them influence directly if they choose to act independently, but when they enter into multilateral organizations and they form groups like G77, they at least get a voice at the global stage where these global powers are listening to them. So for a small power to influence a great power, this Lilliputian strategy of small countries banding together to collectively bind a larger one has proven to be quite effective. And this is one of the reasons which has compelled the developed countries to take actions on climate change, which is a global cause of concern. Similarly, multilateralism might allow one great power, US, to influence another great power, USSR earlier or Russia now, or USSR earlier and China now. Because you have to understand that for a great power to seek control through bilateral ties could be very costly. Because US is never going to directly fight Russia. It has never fought USSR directly. Because it may require bargaining, compromise with the other great power, or direct conflict. But through NATO, US can deter and has deterred Russia very effectively. And so this is one of the examples which shows you that even great power need coalition. And then finally, this is something which all of us can think of very easily, is that multilateralism can offer effective solutions to global challenges. For example, one of the most effective actions so far in the form of Montreal Protocol with respect to ozone depleting substances is a multilateral treaty. Then a similar action is needed on terrorism, and it is simply not possible to counter the menace of terrorism by bilateral or unilateral actions. You need the cooperation of each and every country, as well as their full commitment and faith towards that treaty to eliminate terrorism. So these are the four important advantages. But if everything is so rosy about multilateralism, why learned author has chose to write that this is the time for bilateral actions? And the simple reason is that multilateralism is facing a lot of challenges in the present context. And the first and foremost challenge to multilateralism is coming from its most significant propounder, which is the United States of America and its unilateral actions. Because in past 10 to 20 years, US has taken such unilateral actions and steps which have led other countries to question the very utility of multilateralism. Because currently a perception has been built up that United States is inclined more to act unilaterally rather than through multilateral institutions which were kind of forced upon US itself on the global community. Because if you look at the actions of US in terms of climate change, it never ratified Kyoto Protocol. It ratified, agreed to Paris, walked away, then walked in. It has never been a party to International Criminal Court. It chose to attack Iraq without any proof or evidence of weapons of mass destruction available there, or without the approval of United Nations or Security Council. Then it unilaterally walked away from JCPOA with respect to Iran nuclear deal. And these are just few instances to show you how USA itself is conducting unilateral actions in defiance of all the multilateral organizations. Apart from that, another important threat which is coming from, or in fact, the most important threat which is coming to the multilateralism is from minilateralism. So just like multilateralism, minilateralism is also about countries coming together, but these are a different set of arrangements. These are quite flexible and have ad hoc frameworks whose membership varies based on situational interests, shared values, and relevant capabilities. And the best example of that would be regional blocks like ASEAN or RCEP, which is based on location. Then you might have G7 or G20 on the basis of a financial or economic framework. These are called minilateral institutions. These are minilateral rather than universal. These are voluntary rather than legally binding. These are disaggregated rather than comprehensive. And these are more often than not regional rather than global. And they do not follow top to bottom approach, but they follow bottom to top approach. Then the rise of China has played a very important role in posing a key challenges to these multilateral institutions. On one hand, China is challenging the hegemony of these already existing institutions, especially the financial ones, for example, World Bank and IMF, by creating challenging organizations like One Belt, One Road initiative. Also, the rise of Chinese hegemony within these organizations, because of its size of the economy, is now challenging their majority within these organizations, and now these developed countries are sort of losing the interest within these organizations or in these organizations. Because if these countries do not command power over these organizations, they are going to disband them. And finally, last but not the least, a major challenge to the multilateralism is coming from the threat that it has to offer to the national sovereignty. Because every time you become a part of a multilateral organization, you give up some of the powers. The state has to give up some of its power. For example, when you become a part of WTO, you give up the power to unilaterally change the subsidy regime. Or when you become part of IMF, and if you have to take a loan from IMF, you give up on your sovereignty over financial matters of the country. You have to follow what IMF has to say. This has led to a lot of group of nations to believe that either the way we are doing multilateralism has to change, or we will resort to the minilateralism, which offers much more flexibility. So from the perspective of international relation, this is a very, very important topic which highlights the declining role of multilateralism and rise of minilateralism. Let's now move on to the next article. The next article appears as a column on page number 6 in the political thicket. The election of Speaker of Maharashtra Assembly revealed Governor's partition role. So the office of Speaker in the Maharashtra Assembly was vacant for nearly 17 months, but it was filled up by an election held within 2 days of a new regime taking over. Now, what facilitated Mr. Navrekar's election was the change of the heart on the part of the governor, who has been refusing to fix a date for the election. Now, why governor kept on avoiding for fixing a date for the election of speaker is because the speaker is a very, very powerful position. Because if speaker is in your favor, he can or she can do a lot of stuff for the ruling dispensation. And that is exactly what has happened in Maharashtra. Not just from the perspective of politics, but also from the perspective of UPSC examination, the topic of speaker has been often asked. For example, in 2022, UPSC had asked, with reference to the Deputy Speaker of Lok Sabha, consider the following statements. Similarly, in 2018, the question was about Speaker. Both these questions highlight the importance of this very important constitutional post from the perspective of prelims examination. But do not forget the main syllabus where Parliament and state legislature forms the part of your syllabus. So we are going to go through and understand Speaker and Deputy Speaker of Lok Sabha, and keep in mind that whatever is applicable for presiding officer is applicable for the presiding officer at the state level, that is for the Legislative Assembly as well. So we are going to discuss the constitutional provisions with respect to their appointment, removal, sources of powers, their powers, and the protection which are available to them. So for conducting the proceeding of the House, each House, for example, in case of India, we have Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, has its very own set of presiding officers. While in case of Rajya Sabha, we have chairman and deputy chairman. On the other hand, In case of Lok Sabha, we have Speaker and Deputy Speaker. At the same time, it is important for us to understand as to when these offices came into existence. Was it after the independence, or these offices have been continuing even prior to independence? Most of you might be knowing that these positions came into existence through the Government of India Act 1919. And for the first time, these offices were constituted in year 1921. And so in year 1921, Frederick White and Sachidanand Sinha were appointed as Speaker and Deputy Speaker respectively by the Governor General of India. And so here one important or key element which you cannot miss out is that they were appointed by the Governor General of India but not elected by the council. And so the obvious question is that who was the first Indian to be elected as the Speaker of the Council, and that was Vittal Bhai J. Patel in 1925. So these are very preliminary level facts which you should keep in mind. So let's now move on to the actual provisions related to Speaker and Deputy Speaker. So what you see on screen is the complete provisions related to Deputy Speaker and Speaker, while provisions related to Speaker have been written on the left hand side and provisions related to Deputy Speaker have been written on the right hand side. Let us now start the discussion by understanding the manner of election of both of them. So of course, all of us know that they are elected by the members of the Lok Sabha. And of course, as soon as either of the position of Deputy Speaker or Speaker falls vacant, a re-election has to be conducted. Now here is a key difference between Speaker and Deputy Speaker with respect to who is the one responsible for notifying the re-election. While in case of Speaker, the notification is issued by President, but on the other hand, in case of Deputy Speaker, it is notified by the Speaker himself or herself. Then of course after election, it's very obvious to talk about the removal procedure. And as you can see on both left and right side, whatever has been written is same. So the process of removal of both Speaker and Deputy Speaker are exactly the same, except for a very minute difference, which is Speaker resigns and gives or tenders his resignation to Deputy Speaker, whereas Deputy Speaker tenders his or her resignation to the Speaker. Apart from that, these two conditions, that if a person ceases to be a member of Lok Sabha, ceases to be Speaker or Deputy Speaker, or he or she is removed by a resolution of the House, that is when they stop being the Speaker or Deputy Speaker. Now it is important for us to understand that this removal through resolution of the House should be passed by majority of all the then members of the House. Let us know in the comment box what does this term the then members of the House means, and majority of the then members, what does it denote? So this is absolutely common for Speaker as well as Deputy Speaker. So the only difference for you to recall is that the Speakers and Deputy Speaker resign by tendering their resignation to each other. So we are done with election and removal, but what about their powers? Now since these posts are constitutional in nature, of course they are going to derive their power majorly from the Constitution of India. However, Constitution of India is not the only source of power for these two bodies or chairs. Of course, you have rules of procedure and conduct of business rules of each house, and then you have a lot of parliamentary conventions, somewhat sort of a precedent, which have become the source of power for these two posts. So there are three sources of power for these two posts, which is of course common to both of them. Now rules of procedure and conduct of business is a kind of rule book which has been designed by the Lok Sabha itself to guide the business and proceedings of the House. So they are written in nature. Whereas on the other hand, parliamentary conventions are a set of unspoken rules or precedents which are not written in nature. But this is what has been happening since the time of independence. So in future, if certain similar circumstances emerge, exactly that has to be followed by the Speaker or the Deputy Speaker. But there is no legal force which exists to enforce the convention rules on Speaker or Deputy Speaker. Now here it is important for you to understand that Deputy Speaker is going to perform his or her duties only when the Speaker is absent from the House. Deputy Speaker performs such actions of Speaker when the post of Speaker lies vacant. In either of the cases, when Deputy Speaker is performing the role of Speaker, Deputy Speaker has all the powers which the Speaker is entitled to. Not just that, if Speaker is absent from the joint sitting of both the houses, then in that case also, Speaker chairs the joint sitting of both the houses. That of course brings us to what are the detailed powers of this post. Since both Speaker and Deputy Speaker are presiding officers of the House, their main task is maintenance of order and decorum on the floor of the House, so that the business of the House can be conducted in an orderly fashion. And this, you can say, is the primary responsibility of presiding officers. And they have final power, they have final judgment over these calls that they take. Then the next important task which Speaker and Deputy Speaker presiding officers have is the interpretation. They are the final interpreters of not only the constitutional provisions but also rules of procedure and conduct of business and the parliamentary conventions. If you're reading the newspaper regularly, you must have seen the members of parliament fighting very often, entering into altercation with respect to their differing interpretations of either rules and procedure or parliamentary convention. Now, in all those cases, the speaker or deputy speaker, whoever may be the presiding officer at that point of time, becomes the final interpreter as to what is going to happen. Another very significant power of presiding officer is casting vote. Now, of course, all of us know that presiding officers do not and cannot vote in the first instance, but they can definitely exercise their casting vote in case of a tie. So if there is a resolution or a bill where both the sides have equal number of votes, then presiding officer can take or choose one of the sides, and that becomes the decider. Such a vote becomes a casting vote and it is exercised to remove a deadlock in the House. Then you must have seen a lot of meetings and proceedings of Lok Sabha being adjourned or suspended or kept in suspended animation. And the final authority to either adjourn or suspend is vested in the presiding officer of the House. So the suspension of the meeting or adjournment of the meeting can take place if there is no quorum in the House. So all of us know that quorum of the House is 1/10 of the total membership of the House. So if let's say the total membership of House is 545, which means that at least 55 members have to be present in order to conduct the proceedings of the House. And if this minimum number is not achieved in a particular meeting, then Speaker will call off that particular meeting. Apart from that, if proceedings of a particular meeting are not being conducted in a peaceful manner, there is a lot of chaos on the floor of the House or altercation, then also the presiding officer can adjourn the meeting. Then of course all of us know, and we have seen in the recent DNS, how the presiding officer of a House is the final authority in case of anti-defection law and disqualifications under anti-defection law. So all the decisions under the provisions of the 10th schedule to the Constitution of India are taken by the presiding officer. Then another very important aspect is the categorization or labeling of a particular bill as the money bill. And Speaker of the Lok Sabha has the final authority to categorize a particular bill as a money bill. And his or her decision on this matter is absolutely final. And it is very important because once a bill is categorized as a money bill, the opinion of Rajya Sabha becomes irrelevant on that matter. And so this provision has been very often used by the government who does not have majority in Rajya Sabha to bypass the second house or the Council of States and directly send it to the president for his or her approval. And of course, the last one, we have seen that the presiding officer of Lok Sabha, either Speaker or Deputy Speaker, they chair the joint sitting of both the houses. If Speaker is not present, then Deputy Speaker will chair. But if Deputy Speaker is not present, let us know in the comment section who is the one who is going to preside the joint sitting of both the houses. Now, having looked at the powers of the position of presiding officer of Lok Sabha, you can understand that it is a very crucial to the successful functioning of Lok Sabha and hence in some ways the democracy of our country. And so of course, a lot of protections have also been provided to this post. And so the salaries and allowances of presiding officers, Speaker and Deputy Speaker are fixed by the Parliament and not by the government. Apart from that, the expenditures incurred by the houses are the expenditures charged on the Consolidated Fund of India and hence not subject to the voting every year at the time of the annual budget. And so through this way, the Constitution has made sure that these houses as well as the position of Speaker and Deputy Speaker continue to function in somewhat independent or autonomous manner. Then of course comes a very important aspect which is about the security of the tenure of these posts. because the presiding officer, speaker or deputy speaker can be removed only by a resolution passed by the absolute majority of the house and not by the government. Apart from that, if he or she discontinues to be a member of the Lok Sabha, then of course they do not have the right to become the speaker or continue as a speaker or a deputy speaker. And because this removal is through absolute majority and not by the general majority of the then members present and voting, it is really difficult to remove them once they are elected. Of course, they can be removed if the ruling coalition has the sufficient amount of numbers, but otherwise they cannot be removed just by the whims of the government. Apart from that, the motion for the consideration of removal of the presiding officer can be considered only when it has the support of 50 members of the House, which of course is a very high cutoff for the preliminary stage of removal of the presiding officer. Now, apart from this, we know that there is an absolute immunity to the members of the House when they are speaking within the confines of the House. They can utilize this opportunity to even criticize and mount pressure on the presiding officers. And it's specifically because of that their work and conduct cannot be discussed on the floor of the House, except when the resolution or motion of their removal is under discussion. Except that, barring that, their functioning, their work cannot be discussed or criticized on the floor of the House. Apart from that, a very, very high position has been allocated to the Speaker of the House in the order of the precedence. She is placed at 7th rank in the order of precedence list, along with the Chief Justice of India. So you can see that the constitutional position of the Speaker of Lok Sabha is same as that of Chief Justice of India. And so you can see that the place which has been accorded to the Lok Sabha is of course lower than the President, Vice President, Prime Minister and the governors, but it is higher than the cabinet ministers, chief ministers and other judges of the Supreme Court. And this could be one of the prelims question where the statement could be framed like Chief Justice of India and Speaker of Lok Sabha are accorded the same order of precedence. The next article for discussion has appeared on page number 6, the problem with our university vision. So the number of Indian institutes among the top 1000 globally has risen to 27 from 22 last year. And the Indian Institute of Science Bangalore has moved up 31 places to emerge as the highest ranked Indian institute in 2023 edition. Now in this particular article, the author talks about various issues with India's higher education system. Since he is a professor, he is observing India's higher education from close quarters, and so he just does not suggest us the challenges or the problems, but also gives us way forward. Now, if you're wondering as to how this topic is relevant from the perspective of mains examination, let's have a look at the syllabus of GS paper 2. Governance, Constitution, Polity, Social Justice and IR. Issues relating to development and management of social sectors, health and education is a part of your syllabus. And in mains 2015, UPSC framed this question. The quality of higher education in India requires major improvements to make it internationally competitive. Do you think that the entry of foreign educational institutions would help improve the quality of higher education and technical education in the country? Discuss. And so from the perspective of mains examination, this is a very, very pertinent topic. But before jumping into the challenges or the issues with India's higher education, we should first understand what is the objective that education in general and higher education in particular should strive for. And if you look at it, there are three major ideal learning outcomes from education. The first one is of course imparting knowledge, to provide knowledge in the relevant disciplines to the students. Then the next one is a skill. Since higher education students are on the verge of joining the workforce, it is expected that their education will also impart them with the skills needed for their jobs or enterprises. And then finally, or last but not the least, character development. Students are expected to play a constructive role in the shaping of the society and the world at large, and they are going to derive these values and ideals of modern progressive society from our higher education system. And that is why higher education is such an important element of social development. But when you look at the current state of higher education, there are very few limited institutions where the education being imparted is of world-class quality, but then you have the base of the pyramid where the quality of education is extremely dismal. And so it is important for us to discuss the reasons. When we discuss the reasons, the two reasons which we can mainly segregate all the challenges into are the lack of resources and the poor quality of education. Resources mainly means access to financial resources. So first and foremost, there is a shortage of resources. And this is especially true of state university because the bulk of the enrollment in higher education is handled by the state universities and their affiliated colleges. However, these state universities receive very small amounts of grants in comparison. Around 65% of the budget of UGC goes to central university, which are barely 25 to 30 numbers, whereas thousands of state universities get only 35% of the fund of the UGC. On the other hand, Higher Education Financing Agency, which provides funding for all infrastructure loan to institutions, saw its budget reduced from 2000 crore in financial year 2021 to mere 1 crore in 2021-22. This was the agency which was mainly expected to cater to the demands and needs of the state university. This lack of resources then translates into poor state of infrastructure, especially at the state level universities. And here we are not just talking about the physical infrastructure, we are also talking about academic infrastructure. For example, access to library or the maintenance of the libraries, access to global journals. These are very expensive, and on one hand, the top universities and top institutes in India have access to every resource. The state level universities barely have access to one or two India level journals, but not the global levels. So this is about resources, but then what about the poor quality of education? The poor quality of education is reflected by huge gap which has developed between what the industry needs and what are being taught and what is being taught at the courses. That is first and foremost challenge, which then renders these youth unemployable. And the main reason behind this phenomena is our outdated curriculum. The syllabus of our universities has not been updated in last 30 to 40 years, and they are basically theoretical in nature, devoid of any practical knowledge or experience. At the same time, our college education has absence of or very low or insignificant amount of vocational component, and this is one of the major drawbacks. So for all those who do not understand vocational component, it's basically education and skills based training programs that prepare people for a specific job, trade or craft. Not everyone can be expected to complete BTech and then MTech and then pursue higher education of PhD, super specialization. Some people need to be employed after class 12th by 1 year of or 2 years of ITI training. And that is what is lacking at our state and national level universities. We are not teaching people so that they can be immediately employed. We are teaching them just for the sake of degree. Then of course, at the level of human resource, especially at the faculty or the professor level, we have a lot of problem. First and foremost is a large level of vacancies. According to UGC, the total number of sanctioned teaching posts in various central universities are around 17,000. There are around 6,000 vacancies. So you can see that more than 35% of the posts of associate, assistant and professor level are lying vacant at our various university levels. Apart from that, there is a clear-cut lack of attraction towards the teaching as a profession. Students or the best of the best do not find teaching very attractive, and hence best of the talents are not being attracted towards faculty position. At the same time, there is a clear-cut lack of accountability for teachers. There is no mechanism for ensuring the accountability and performance of professors in universities and colleges. And this is unlike foreign universities where the performance of college faculty is evaluated by their peers as well as students. And finally, the job of the higher education is just not to impart knowledge, but it is also to create knowledge. And knowledge is created through research. And there is inadequate focus on research in higher education institutes in our country. The National Research Foundation, which was constituted to improve research infrastructure in universities, has yet not been approved. There are insufficient resources and facilities as well as a limited number of quality faculty to advise students towards research. So it all boiled down to lack of resources and then quality of education. There are not good faculties, because of which the research is inadequate. To do adequate research, you need funds, which are again lacking. So it all boils down to the vicious cycle of resource and quality of education. So what can we do about it? First and foremost, we need to provide a lot of resources to our state level universities. We need to mobilize a lot of funds. Now this mobilization could come in the form of endowments, contributions from industry, or from alumni network. Because it seems like government is not going to distribute funds to the state universities anymore, and state governments are not in a position to do so. Then as far as quality of education is concerned, first and foremost, we need to identify the skill gaps. Since there is a lack of employable skills, we need to identify those skills which are going to make a particular student directly employable. And then there is a need for us to include all those skills along with vocational training into our course structure. Then, just like foreign universities, it is time for India to increase industry academic collaboration. There can be a situation where a professor collabs with an industry of his or her related field. His or her students then get employed in that field, and the work of the research benefits the private organization. And this mutual benefit or this symbiosis is not going to just help the academia but also the industry. At the same time, it is time to enforce accountability and performance scrutiny for the faculties. A system of performance audit of professors based on the feedback given by their students and colleagues should be set up. Apart from that, other criteria like how many papers they have published, in which of the publications they have published a paper, how frequently they are publishing paper, and how well they are utilizing the funding money, all should be tracked into the performance review. And then finally, accreditation. The process of providing affiliation of a university to colleges. It is very, very important because a lot of non-transparent, opaque processes have been adopted while awarding affiliation. And now is the time to revamp the accreditation process. So from the perspective of mains examination, a 10 or a 15 marker could be asked about the issues with India's higher education system, and these points as a challenges and way forward are more than sufficient to enable you to answer that question. Let us now move on to the next news. So the next news which we have taken has appeared on page number 1. Shinde wins vote, says he's with Sena. So after the new government won the trust vote in the assembly on Monday, Chief Minister Eknath Shinde said he and the MLAs with him had not left the Shiv Sena and remained loyal to the party. Now when he had won the trust vote, it is important for us to understand from the point of view of constitution and polity what the trust vote is. So under Article 164(2), the Council of Ministers shall be collectively responsible to the Legislative Assembly of the state. Thus, it is important that the collective responsibility is tested on the floor of the House to maintain its confidence. Similarly, for Lok Sabha, the Council of Ministers remain in office as long as it enjoys the confidence of Lok Sabha according to Article 75, Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution. But there may be instances which may call for the government in power to prove their majority to run their government. It is on such rare instances when no confidence motion is moved mainly by the opposition to prove that the government enjoying power does not have the requisite or the required majority to carry on. In other words, the Council of Ministers lacks collective responsibility to the Assembly of the state. So, the no confidence motion has not been explicitly defined or mentioned in the Constitution either with respect to Parliament or state assemblies. No confidence motion has been mentioned in the rules of procedure of Lok Sabha and respective state assemblies. If no confidence motion is passed, then the government is bound to resign as it results in defeat of the government because the government was unable to prove their majority on the floor of the House. So if the government wants to prove their majority, they bring in trust vote. When the opposition wants to prove that the government is not commanding the majority, they bring in no confidence motion. It is also important to understand that Supreme Court in SR Bommai held explicitly that in situations where there is hung assembly, which means that where no political party has obtained a clear majority or seats, the final decision rests not with the various feuding parties but with the concerned legislature through floor test. So floor test has ultimately become the decider of the destiny of the Council of Ministers. So no confidence motion or when Rule 198 of Lok Sabha is invoked. The Council of Ministers remains in office as long as it enjoys the confidence of Lok Sabha according to Article 75, Clause 3. The moment it expresses a lack of confidence in the Council of Ministers, the government is constitutionally bound to resign whether or not the Prime Minister recommends a dissolution of the House. In order to ascertain this confidence, the rules provide for moving a motion to this effect, which is called no confidence motion. A motion of no confidence, once admitted, has to be taken up within 10 days of the leave being granted. Notice of no confidence motion can also be withdrawn by members concerned by sending letters of withdrawal signed by all the signatories to the notice before the item is taken up in the House. While on the other hand, it's very obvious that Rajya Sabha is not empowered to entertain a motion of no confidence because the government is collectively responsible to the Lok Sabha or the House of the People and not to the Council of States or Rajya Sabha. The need for space sustainability has appeared on text and context page. So UK hosted the 4th Summit for Space Sustainability in London in collaboration with the Secure World Foundation. During the summit, UK launched a new plan for space sustainability and hence the word space sustainability has come into news. UK has called for an Astro Carta for space sustainability based on Artemis Accords, which was a model for sustainable space exploration. So as all of us know that outer space is considered a shared natural resource. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in 2019 adopted a set of 21 voluntary, non-binding guidelines to ensure the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. Now, from the perspective of GS Paper 3, this is a very, very important topic because under Science and Technology, awareness in the field of space is a part of your syllabus, and the space sustainability or sustainability of space programs has come into question. They have come into question because there are increasing concern with respect to the challenges in achieving space sustainability. When you send a spacecraft into the orbit, you might not be sure of either the safety or security of the spacecraft or the financial cost involved in sustaining the spacecraft in the orbit. And the reason is orbital crowding. With the emergence of large constellations and complex satellites, there is a risk of collisions and interference with radio frequencies. Then, the overcrowding itself poses a direct threat to the operations and safety of a mission and is likely to cause legal and insurance related conflicts. Then, after the completion of a mission, an end of life protocol requires space objects to be moved to the graveyard orbit or to a low altitude. Neither of the options is sustainable in long term. Then apart from this, the factors which is beyond our control is the solar and magnetic storms. These storms can potentially damage communication systems. Such space weather threats need to be addressed along with the efforts to identify the terrestrial carbon footprint of outer space missions. So these are the 4 reasons because of which the space sustainability has been called into question in recent times. And we know that India has very well thriving space program headed by ISRO. And so, what are the recent initiatives taken by India with respect to space sustainability? First and foremost is Project Netra. The Indian Space Research Organization has initiated Project Netra to monitor the space debris. Then apart from that, Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center or INSPACE, India expects an increased role of the private sector in India's space activities. Then recently, to provide in-orbit servicing, ISRO is developing a docking experiment called SpadeX. It looks at enhancing the capability of a satellite. Hence, the SpadeX can increase the longevity of a mission and also provide a futuristic option to combine missions and experiments. Then India and US have signed a new pact for monitoring space objects at the 2+2 dialogue as well. So you can see that space sustainability is definitely a challenge, but India is doing well to account for these challenges as well. This next article, Deal or No Deal, has appeared as a column on page number 6. So US and Iran should start direct talks to find common ground on nuclear deal. So we have seen that Iran had entered into nuclear deal under JCPOA arrangement. This was all about controlling Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Later on, under the presidency of Mr. Donald Trump, US unilaterally walked out of this arrangement. And then the news started emerging that Iran had started its enrichment program, which is now again becoming a cause of concern, and hence reviving the Iran nuclear deal became one of the major points of campaign of Mr. Donald Trump when he was contesting for the presidentship. Now he has become a president, and now it is his responsibility to again negotiate new terms of agreement with Iran. As and when they will be agreed upon, we will discuss them. But as of now, it is important for us to understand what an enrichment is and how does it help nations from the perspective of science and technology. Now, whenever we read about Iran's nuclear enrichment program or North Korea's nuclear program, we often get to hear this term enrichment a lot. So what does this enrichment actually means? Why is it so important for overall enrichment of a country's nuclear program? And so that is what we are going to understand in this discussion. So starting with some background. So apart from 20% enriched uranium, Iran has also produced 25 kg of 60% enriched uranium, a level that only countries with nuclear weapons have the physical capability to produce. And what makes the 60% enrichment level particularly threatening is that the tricky process of enrichment becomes far easier and requires fewer centrifuges as it moves into higher purities. In other words, getting to 90% purity is much easier starting from 20% and easier still starting from 60%. So basically what Iran wants to communicate to the world is that it is maybe few months away from designing its first nuclear weapon. Or maybe Iran already has one. So all of us know that under the historic 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and P5+1, the world powers, Iran was not meant to enrich uranium above 3.6% level. So to give you the context, nuclear weapons require 90% enriched uranium. And starting from 60%, it looks like Iran is just months away from its nuclear weapon. So what is this enrichment all about? And why is it needed to produce a nuclear weapon? So we know that just like most metals, uranium also comes from nature. But natural uranium consists of two different isotopes. Nearly 99% of the uranium consists of uranium-238, whereas only 0.7% of the uranium is uranium-235. Now, if you want to produce an atomic bomb, if you want to become a nuclear power, uranium-235 is the one which you need to increase because it is the one which is radioactive. It is the one which releases the energy. Whereas uranium-238 is just like your iron. It does not have any radioactivity. And so uranium-235 is a fissile material that can sustain a chain reaction. As you can see on the screen, this chain reaction is what leads to a nuclear bomb or a nuclear reaction inside a nuclear power plant. And so enrichment is a process which increases the proportion of uranium-235 through the process of isotope separation. So you take 1 kg of uranium, remove the 99% of 238, just keep 0.7%. And that is the process. When you repeat it over 1000 times, you ultimately get 20%, 60% or even 90% enriched uranium. So when we talk about enriched uranium, we talk about increasing the number of uranium-235. So the goal of uranium enrichment is to raise the percentage levels of uranium-235, which is often done through the use of centrifuges. As you can see on the screen, these are the machines that spin a form of unrefined or natural uranium at a very high speeds. And the rotation motion leads to the separation of heavier 238 from lighter 235. For nuclear weapons, enrichment is required up to 90% or more, as we have already talked about. But for nuclear reactors, for nuclear power plants, enrichment is required up to 3-4% level. And so that is why when Iran nuclear deal was finalized, when Iran claimed that it needs an access to its own nuclear power plant, it was allowed enrichment up to 3-4%. But now what it looks like that it already has 20% enriched capability and has acquired 60% enriched uranium from somewhere. And since we are talking about Iran nuclear deal, we cannot go without discussing the key points. In 2015, Iran with P5+1 group of world powers, which were USA, UK, France, China, Russia and Germany, agreed on a long-term deal on its nuclear program. The deal was named as Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under the deal, Iran agreed to curb its nuclear activity in return for the lifting of sanctions and access to the global trade. The agreement allowed Iran to accumulate small amounts of uranium for research and for producing power, but it banned the enrichment of uranium, which could be used to make nuclear weapons. Iran was also required to redesign a heavy water reactor being built, whose spent fuel would contain plutonium suitable for a bomb and to allow international inspections. In May 2018, however, the USA abandoned the deal, criticizing its flawed nature and reinstated the sanctions on Iran, which impacted India also, because Iran became the second largest supplier of crude oil to India, and India had to cut down that almost to the zero level. Now, since the sanctions were tightened, Iran has gone back on the treaty and has been steadily breaking some of its commitment to pressure the remaining signatories to find a way to provide sanction relief. So from the perspective of prelims examination, this is a very important news. The term JCPOA has already been asked in the prelims examination, and it is important for you to understand the enrichment process, or what does it actually mean. Let us now move on to the next news. This next news has appeared on page number 13. Myanmar hosts first regional meetings in school. So Myanmar's military government yesterday hosted the first high-level regional meeting since the army took over last year, and the important factor was the presence of Chinese Foreign Minister Mr. Wang Yi and counterparts from Mekong Delta nations. Now, terms like these or regional groupings like these, which have direct or indirect impact on India's interests, are very important, as well as these regional rivers. For example, in 2020, UPSC had given the rivers, and you had to identify which are the local seas in which they flow into. In 2015, UPSC had asked, in Mekong-Ganga cooperation, an initiative of 6 countries, which of the following are not a participants? So you can see that these kinds of initiatives are very, very important. And when LANCANG-MEKONG cooperation group has met, it is important for us to cover it. So first and foremost, this grouping is a Chinese-led initiative that includes the countries of Mekong Delta. So as we know that Mekong River emerges in China, where it is known as LANCANG. China has built 10 dams along the upper stretches of Mekong, where it is known as LANCANG. So they are two different names for the same river. Originates from Tibetan Plateau, the river has its source in Yushu province. The river has its source in Yushu of Qinghai province. It is called Lancang River in China, while in its downstream after flowing out from Yunnan province, it is called Mekong River, running across Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia and Vietnam. And all these countries form the part of Mekong Delta cooperation. Now, the presence of China in Mekong Delta cooperation is a significant one, because many of the lower riparian countries are wary of an increasing number of hydroelectric projects that are altering the flow and raising concerns of ecological damage. China has been criticized for the dams upstream on the Mekong River, which affect water levels and downstream fisheries that are important to several Southeast Asian nations. China is Myanmar's biggest trading partner and an old ally, and China is one of the only big countries which actually supported or did not criticize the military coup. China has invested billions of dollars in Myanmar's mines, oil and gas pipelines and other infrastructure, and is its major arms supplier together with Russia. Many in Myanmar suspect China of supporting the military takeover. Now, from the perspective of India, the increasing presence of China in India's neighborhood is a continuing cause of concern, and this event has reinforced that concern. The next article is the lead article on page number 6. India needs to scale up direct nutrition interventions. The author says that preconception nutrition, maternal nutrition, and child feeding practices in the first 1,000 days of life need priority. Now, in this article, she mentions Poshan 2.0 Abhiyan, and she mentions National Family Health Survey 5 report data, both of which have been discussed in the DNS before. But what has not been taken up in DNS is the link between women empowerment and malnutrition. A healthy woman gives birth to a healthy child. That is something which you have to remember. India, with 53% of women in reproductive age suffering from anemia, highlights the reason behind nutritional crisis in India, where around 38% of the children under 5 years are stunted and around 21% are wasted. And hence, there is a need to understand this link between women empowerment and malnutrition. So you have to understand that when it comes to health, undernourished girls have greater likelihood of becoming undernourished mothers, who in turn have a greater chance of giving birth to low birth weight babies, perpetuating an intergenerational cycle of undernourishment. Then it is very important for women to have agency, to have right over their marriage and reproduction. This cycle can be compounded further, the cycle which we have mentioned in the first column, in young mothers, especially adolescent girls who begin childbearing before they have grown and developed enough. Short intervals between pregnancies can exacerbate nutrition deficits, which are then passed to their children. Of course, increase in female literacy, awareness about nutrient-rich diet, good feeding practices, personal hygiene are very important for children's nutrition. Then of course, women empowerment brings along financial independence of women, which leads to increased food expenditure in the household. And finally, integrating women in farm management, where women farmers tend to prefer crops that would contribute to household dietary diversity while promoting food and nutrition security. So you can see that women empowerment is key to malnutrition, which was the aspect which was raised by the author today. Two other aspects have been covered in the DNS a priori.